It was September 2013, the air turning crisp as autumn began to take hold. For most, it was just the changing of the seasons, but for Joan and Harry Savage, it marked the start of another adventure. At 68 and 65 years old, the couple wasn't new to the great outdoors. In fact, they had spent over 4 decades hiking the trails of North America, tackling vast distances and remote paths with a seasoned ease that many younger hikers would envy. This was no ordinary walk in the woods. They were well prepared, methodical, and experienced. Each step they took was calculated. So, when they set off on their latest trek along a picturesque stretch of the Appalachian Trail in Virginia, no one could have predicted that their journey would end in mystery. Joan and Harry disappeared without a trace, leaving behind nothing but questions. Why, with all their experience, did they vanish? And why was there no sign of them at all? Joan and Harry Savage were no strangers to adventure. For over 40 years, they had walked the trails of North America, experiencing the wild in a way that few ever had. Their love for the outdoors wasn't just a pastime, it was a lifestyle, one that had shaped their relationship and their view of the world. By September 2013, the couple was seasoned in the ways of the Appalachian Trail, a sprawling route that stretches across the eastern United States, winding through forests and mountains, offering some of the most breathtaking views in the world. The journey they embarked on that autumn was meant to be like any other. They were heading into the dense forests of Virginia, a section of the Appalachian that was known for its rugged beauty. The weather had been temperate, the days still warm but with a crisp edge to the air that signaled the approaching fall. Joan, 65, and Harry, 68, had spent weeks preparing for the trip. They bought new gear, lightweight sleeping bags, a fresh first aid kit, and lightweight stoves for their meals. The details of the journey had been meticulously planned. Maps were studied, provisions carefully chosen, and every possible outcome accounted for. But there was one thing they could not plan for: the unknown. The couple's plan was simple: take it slow, enjoy the views, and soak in the quiet of the wilderness. They had no intentions of completing the entire trail. Instead, they chose to enjoy the most scenic sections at their own pace. They had done this before, taking their time to admire the beauty around them, knowing that speed wasn't the goal, experience was. On September 6th, they signed the trailhead logbook at the parking lot, leaving behind their names, their route, and their estimated return date, 2 weeks later. The first few days went as planned. They hiked 15 to 20 kilometers a day, meeting fellow hikers along the way, exchanging pleasantries about the weather, the beauty of the landscape, and their love for the mountains. To those they met, they were an ordinary elderly couple, full of life and spirit, walking at their own pace, but always happy to talk to those they passed on the trail. Nothing out of the ordinary seemed to occur. No conflicts, no signs of trouble. Just another quiet journey through the woods. But by September 12th, something unusual happened. The couple decided to take a brief detour to the small town of Purisburg, Virginia. It was common for long-distance hikers to leave the trail for a day or two to resupply, rest, or simply enjoy the comforts of civilization. It was here that they would restock their food supplies, do their laundry, and check in with their family. They called their son, reassuring him that they were in good health, though a little tired from the trek. The weather was starting to turn, but they were prepared. Joan even took the time to send a postcard to her sister, describing the breathtaking views and how their legs ached, but how happy they were. That was the last anyone heard from them. The couple returned to the trail on the same day, planning to continue their journey. The next week was supposed to be like all the others, but it wasn't. By September 20th, their son was expecting the usual check-in call. But when the day passed without word, he wasn't immediately worried. Sometimes, cell phone reception was poor on the trail. A day late wasn't uncommon. But as the 21st came and went, and still no call, his worry began to grow. By the 23rd, his anxiety reached its peak. He called the National Park Rescue Service, and the search began. The search operation was launched immediately. The area where Joan and Harry were last seen was vast, covering miles of dense forest and mountainous terrain. Rangers, volunteers, and even helicopter teams were involved, combing through the wilderness in search of any signs. They checked the trailhead, where the couple's car was still parked, an indication that they hadn't left the area. They scoured the area where the couple had been seen last, walking the trails and surrounding terrain, hoping for any clue that might explain their disappearance. Days passed. The search extended, becoming more intense. Volunteer searchers, along with trained dogs, methodically combed every part of the wilderness they could reach. They checked ravines, climbed rocky ledges, and used helicopters to get an aerial view of the area, scanning the treetops for any sign of the couple's brightly colored gear or a stray object that might have been dropped. But there was nothing. Not a single item of theirs was found. No tent, no backpacks, no food wrappers, no trail markers. It was as if they had vanished into thin air. The lack of evidence only made the situation more mysterious. How could two experienced hikers, well prepared for the rigors of the trail, disappear without leaving a trace? Even if they had been victims of an accident, say, a fall or a wild animal attack, there should have been some remnants left behind, but there was nothing. The authorities were baffled. Theories began to form. Some speculated that the couple had suffered some sort of accident, perhaps falling into one of the many deep ravines along the trail. Others considered the possibility of an attack from a wild animal, although it seemed unlikely given their experience and the lack of any evidence to support that theory. And then there was the thought that they had been the victims of foul play, a theory that seemed more plausible as days turned into weeks, but one that couldn't be proved. Weeks passed, then months. No one could find a clue. The search was eventually scaled back, and the case was officially deemed a cold one. Joan and Harry Savage had simply disappeared, leaving behind nothing but a trail that abruptly stopped. Their disappearance, once a source of widespread concern, became just another mysterious case, one of the many unexplained stories shared around campfires by hikers on the Appalachian Trail. But for their family, the case never stopped haunting them. Each unanswered question, each missing piece of the puzzle, kept them trapped in a painful limbo. They would never know for sure what had happened to Joan and Harry, why after all their preparation they had disappeared so suddenly, why there was nothing to indicate what had gone wrong. And so the mystery of their disappearance lingered, unsolved and unresolved, until a chance discovery nearly 10 years later would change everything. Nearly 10 years had passed since Joan and Harry Savage disappeared, leaving behind only an empty trail and countless unanswered questions. What had happened to them? How could two experienced hikers, well prepared for the harsh conditions of the Appalachian Trail, simply vanish without a trace? For their family, the mystery was a constant, a dark cloud that hung over their lives, preventing them from moving forward. Despite numerous investigations and the search that had been as exhaustive as it was fruitless, there had been no sign of the couple. It seemed as though the forest had swallowed them whole. But in July 2023, just when the story of Joan and Harry had begun to fade into the background of cold cases, an unexpected discovery would breathe new life into the case, and with it, a far more sinister reality. The place where this discovery was made was an abandoned farm, located roughly 5 kilometers from where the couple had last been seen. The farm had been neglected for years, its buildings decaying and its fields overgrown with weeds. No one had paid much attention to it until a construction crew was sent to clear the area. The workers were tasked with removing the dense brush and debris that had accumulated over the years, preparing the land for future development. As they worked their way through the backyard of the old farmhouse, one of the men, Mike, stumbled upon something unusual, buried beneath the rotting leaves and thick carpet of ivy. It was heavy, metallic, rusted with age. At first he thought it might be some sort of old farming equipment left behind when the property was abandoned. But as he pulled it aside, he realized it was a metal plate, one that covered a dark, gaping hole beneath it. A well. But this wasn't the kind of well that people would typically associate with a quaint country farm. It wasn't the charming stone well with a wooden bucket. This one was functional, made of concrete rings, utilitarian and plain. the workers peered inside, using their phone flashlights to illuminate the depths of the well. What they saw at the bottom made their blood run cold. It wasn't water that filled the well, but something else entirely. At first, they thought it might be the remains of some animal, a deer, perhaps, or even a bear. But as they looked closer, their stomachs twisted in disbelief. The bones were human, 2 separate piles of bones, neatly arranged, yet lifeless. And, most disturbingly, there were no skulls. Immediately, the workers called the police. Within minutes, the first patrol car arrived at the scene, followed by investigators and forensic experts. The area was cordoned off, and what had started as a routine clearing of land quickly became the focal point of a major investigation. The scene was both eerie and unsettling. 2 piles of bones at the bottom of an abandoned well, the absence of skulls, a chilling detail that immediately raised alarms. No one knew who these remains belonged to, but the circumstances seemed far too deliberate to be anything other than a murder. Forensics teams descended into the well, carefully retrieving each bone, taking extreme care to preserve any evidence that could shed light on what had happened. As they worked, the investigators couldn't help but feel that there was something profoundly unsettling about the way the bodies had been hidden. The bones were stripped of all clothing, and there were no other items around the bodies. No shoes, no bags, no metal buckles from belts, not even a single piece of fabric. It was as if the bodies had been thrown into the well, deliberately stripped of any identifying features. The discovery seemed almost too calculated to be random. Everything about it felt wrong, as though the bodies had been placed there with intention. And then, among the bones, something else was found. A small metal object embedded in one of the pelvic bones. It was a surgical pin, the kind used in hip replacement surgery. As the forensic team examined the pin, they found it was engraved with a serial number. The investigators immediately recognized the significance of this. The pin was not just a random object, it was a critical piece of evidence. The pin was traced back to a batch of medical equipment manufactured in 2005, and after further investigation, it was discovered that it had been used in Joan Savage's hip replacement surgery. The connection was clear. The body of the woman in the well was, without a doubt, Joan Savage. But the case didn't end there. The forensic experts were able to identify the second set of remains as belonging to Harry Savage. DNA samples were taken from their surviving children, and a comparison with the bone tissue confirmed the worst, their parents were truly gone. However, the discovery raised more questions than answers. Why had Joan and Harry been stripped naked before being discarded in the well? Why were their skulls missing? The marks on the bones suggested that the heads had been severed with a sharp instrument, something far more deliberate than the random acts of nature that investigators had originally considered. This was not the work of an animal or an accident. This was a carefully executed murder. The lack of skulls and the absence of any personal belongings surrounding the remains sent shockwaves through the investigation. It was clear that the bodies had been placed there with a calculated, sinister purpose. The brutality of the act, combined with the coldness of the location and the years of neglect, painted a picture of something far darker than anyone had anticipated. The case was no longer just a missing persons mystery. It was a double murder, and the search for the killer had begun in earnest. But even with this new information, the questions continued to multiply. Who had done this, and why? The discovery of Joan and Harry's remains, after nearly a decade of silence, had turned their disappearance from a tragic mystery into a full-blown criminal investigation. But as investigators dug deeper, they realized that this discovery was only the beginning. The true story of what happened to Joan and Harry Savage and the person responsible for their deaths was still hidden beneath the layers of time waiting to be uncovered. As the investigation into the deaths of Joan and Harry Savage progressed, the focus inevitably turned towards Randall Lee Rogers, a man whose name began to emerge as the key suspect. Rogers was a recluse, a man who had fallen out of society. He lived in a small, dilapidated trailer just a stone's throw away from the abandoned farm where the bodies had been discovered. His proximity to the crime scene, coupled with his murky past, raised suspicions, but the case was far from straightforward. Rogers had been living in the area at the time of Joan and Harry's disappearance, and while that alone didn't make him guilty, the timing was unsettling. He had a history of violent behavior, having served time in prison for aggravated assault after a drunken bar fight several years earlier. The victim of that attack had survived, but Rogers' violent tendencies were enough to make the investigators sit up and take notice. After his release from prison, he had moved into the trailer, which was just 200 yards from where the remains of the savages were found. It seemed almost impossible that he could have been unaware of the well, hidden beneath layers of debris just beyond his property. But the most chilling aspect was the connection between Rogers' criminal past and the murder itself. The forensic examination of the remains had revealed that the savages' heads had been severed with a sharp instrument, something that seemed disturbingly familiar given Rogers' violent history with knives. The investigators were not willing to dismiss the possibility that Rogers could have been the one who carried out the brutal killings, but there was one problem. There was no concrete evidence to directly link him to the crime. Despite the circumstantial evidence, his location near the crime scene, his violent history, and the nature of the murders, the police could not find any physical evidence to charge Rogers with the murders. There was no DNA from him found at the crime scene, no fingerprints, no witness statements placing him near the well, and no murder weapon that could be traced back to him. In fact, when questioned, Rogers denied any involvement, giving vague and contradictory statements. He claimed he didn't even remember much about the period when the couple had disappeared, offering the weak defense that his memory was foggy and he hadn't seen anything unusual. As the days went by, the investigators felt the pressure mounting. They were convinced Rogers was involved, but the lack of hard evidence left them frustrated and, perhaps more importantly, unable to make an arrest. Still, the case wasn't going to be dropped. He remained a person of interest, and the authorities kept digging into his past, hoping to find a crack in his alibi, some shred of evidence that would connect him definitively to the crime. As the investigation unfolded, the question of why Randall Lee Rogers might have killed Joan and Harry Savage became increasingly important. The police knew he had no connection to the couple, no apparent reason to target them specifically. There were no reports of any altercations or conflicts between him and the savages, no evidence suggesting that the couple had done anything to provoke him. That raised the question, if the murders were not personal, was there another motive? The most obvious theory, of course, was that it was a robbery gone wrong. The savages were not wealthy, but as experienced hikers, they would have had camping equipment and supplies that could have been valuable to someone in Rogers' position. Perhaps the killings were the result of a chance encounter, a robbery that escalated into something far more sinister. But this theory had its flaws. If Rogers had been simply trying to steal from the couple, why would he have gone to such extreme lengths to hide the bodies? Why had he taken the time to sever their heads, and why had he stripped them naked before disposing of them in a well? These actions seemed far too deliberate for a crime of opportunity. Others suggested that the motive could have been more deeply rooted in Rogers' psyche. He had been a loner for years, living on the outskirts of society, a man whose violent tendencies had already been proven. Could it have been a crime born of paranoia, or perhaps some deeper, darker need to exert control over others? If Rogers had been aware of the couple's movements, if he had watched them from his trailer, perhaps he saw an opportunity to act on a much deeper psychological impulse. Was it possible that his hatred for strangers, for those who dared to pass through his isolated world, had driven him to lash out at the savages? The theory of a psychologically motivated crime began to take hold in the minds of some investigators. The brutality of the act, the careful decapitation, the removal of personal items, the strange ritual of the disposal pointed to a crime that was more than just a random robbery. It suggested someone with a disturbed mind, someone who had planned the killings with chilling precision. Rogers' lack of remorse or fear during his interrogation only added fuel to the fire. He seemed almost indifferent to the accusations being hurled at him, offering only vague denials and a constant refrain of, "I don't remember." Despite all the clues that seemed to point towards him, there was still no direct evidence to charge him with murder. The investigators continued to pursue every lead, tracking his movements, interviewing his former neighbors, and searching his past for anything that might give them the breakthrough they desperately needed. But as the investigation dragged on, it became increasingly clear that the mystery of Joan and Harry Savage's deaths was not going to be solved easily. Was Rogers the killer, or was there something else, a darker force at play in the shadows of the Appalachian Trail? Only time would tell, but the questions continued to mount, and the true motive behind the murders remained as elusive as ever. What had started as a missing persons case was now firmly rooted in the realm of true crime, and the more the investigators uncovered, the more disturbing the mystery became. But without hard evidence, the case would remain unsolved, leaving the truth of what happened to Joan and Harry Savage hanging in the air, just out of reach. As the investigation into the brutal deaths of Joan and Harry Savage came to a close, the family found themselves with answers but no closure. The remains of Joan and Harry had been identified beyond any doubt, their bodies lying in an abandoned well, and the link to Randall Lee Rogers, though not legally proven, seemed undeniable. Yet, despite all the evidence that pointed to him, the case was left hanging in the air, unresolved. There were no direct witnesses, no confession from Rogers, and most frustratingly, no tangible evidence that could link him to the murders in a way that could withstand the scrutiny of a court of law. The absence of physical proof, the lack of any concrete forensic evidence, this was what ultimately thwarted any possibility of bringing him to trial. The investigators had done everything they could, yet all they had was circumstantial evidence, his proximity to the crime scene, his violent history, and the unsettling details of the crime itself. But none of these were enough to bring him to justice. The lack of a clear resolution to the case left everyone involved with a lingering sense of frustration. Joan and Harry's deaths were no longer a mystery of missing persons, but a brutal double murder that would never be fully explained. The possibility of knowing the why behind their deaths seemed to slip further and further away with each passing day. Was it a random act of violence, or was there a deeper, more twisted motive behind it? No one could say for sure, and the investigators knew that, without concrete evidence, there was nothing more they could do. For the Savage family, the pain of not knowing the full truth was unbearable. While they had long feared the worst, the confirmation that their parents were dead should have brought them some sense of closure. Instead, they were left with only questions. Why had they been targeted? Why had they been so brutally murdered? The uncertainty gnawed at them, preventing them from fully grieving or moving on. They knew where their parents had ended up, but they could never know the true circumstances of their deaths. The family's sense of helplessness was mirrored by the larger community. The case had captured public attention when the couple first disappeared, and now, with the discovery of their remains, it became the subject of discussion once again. But the lack of justice was maddening. The people who had followed the case, who had hoped for an answer, were now left with nothing more than a chilling, unsolved mystery. The public was left with the haunting image of Joan and Harry, their heads missing, their bodies discarded without a trace of clothing or personal belongings, a crime so deliberate and cold that it shook the very idea of what could drive someone to commit such an act. For the police, too, the case was a source of constant frustration. They had come so close to solving the puzzle, yet were thwarted by the limitations of the law. They knew that Rogers had the means and the motive, yet they could not tie him to the crime in any definitive way. It was a reminder of the sometimes harsh reality of criminal investigations, where even the most glaring suspicions are not enough to bring about justice. As the years went by, the story of Joan and Harry Savage faded from the headlines. The case became one of those unsolved mysteries that people spoke of in hushed tones around campfires or during quiet conversations about unsolved true crime. Yet, for the family, the pain never faded. The unanswered questions about the circumstances of their deaths and about the person who had taken their lives remained a constant source of grief. The lack of justice in the case was, in many ways, the final tragedy. Joan and Harry were gone, but their memory would live on, not in the way they had hoped, not as a couple remembered for their adventurous spirit and love for nature, but as victims of a crime that would never be fully understood. Their family would never find the peace they so desperately sought. They had their answers, but without the closure of knowing the full truth, the wound remained open. In the end, the case of Joan and Harry Savage became a stark reminder of how fragile the pursuit of justice can be. Sometimes, even when the truth is within reach, it remains just out of grasp, leaving behind a trail of unanswered questions and a profound sense of helplessness. The system, despite its best efforts, was powerless to provide the closure the family so desperately needed, and the mystery of what happened to Joan and Harry would never be fully solved. For the Savage family, it was a lesson in the limits of the law and the harsh reality that sometimes the truth simply remains hidden, no matter how hard we search for it. The case would forever be a tragic reminder of the cruelty of a world where justice can sometimes slip through the cracks, leaving nothing but the echo of lost lives and unspoken stories. As we reach the end of this haunting tale, it's important to remember that sometimes the darkness of crime doesn't come with an explanation. The murder of Joan and Harry Savage remains shrouded in mystery, not just because of the brutality of the crime, but because of the unanswered questions that linger. Why were they targeted? Who could commit such a horrifying act, and what drove them to do it? The truth, it seems, is something that will never be fully known. The world is full of unanswered questions, of mysteries that remain just out of reach. The story of Joan and Harry Savage is a reminder that evil doesn't always have a reason. It exists in the shadows, in the forgotten corners of the world, in the minds of those we might never understand. Sometimes, no matter how much we seek the truth, it remains buried, waiting for the right moment to surface. Though justice was never served for Joan and Harry, their story serves as a chilling reminder of the darkness that exists in the world and the mysteries that, no matter how much we want to solve them, will always remain just beyond our grasp. The cold case of their deaths is a puzzle that, like so many others, may never be pieced together. If you found this story gripping and want to dive deeper into the darkness of crime and unsolved mysteries, make sure to like, share, and subscribe. Our journey through the eerie and the unexplained is just beginning. Stay tuned for more stories that will leave you questioning what you know about justice, mystery, and the unknown.